in June. In spite of adding around 100 basis points of tightening this year and 75 to the peak rate next year, that looks like a pretty big revision in the view as to how persistent these core inflation pressures are likely to be and how much work it's going to take to hammer them down. So what do you think you've learned about the persistence of core inflation pressures in that period from June till now?
I think that's fair. I think I think the shelter prices have picked up tremendously. I think the breadth of the price increases in the most recent reports is what was worrisome. So when the February 2022 report came out, I keep mentioning that one because we did most of our discovery work on that one. You could look at 15% of the consumer core basket and take note of the fact that it was generating 20% annual inflation. And the remaining 85%, it was still at a very unhealthy 4% rate, but there was that dichotomy. To the extent that it had been maintained that it was a small 15% bucket, that like round trip, you could have more confidence in this. I think what we learned in the time period that you're pointing to is it was broader. It shows up from shelter. Shelter is undoubtedly going to take longer. To have that effect. The CPI is weighted more than the PCE. That's one reason years and years ago the Fed shifted to PCE. But I think we had a sobering assessment that we've got more work ahead, and we've got a big increase in the funds rate. Still hopeful that it's not so large against an otherwise pretty good fundamentals for the U.S. economy that we can make it through that. But there's still a lot of uncertainty and so many things going around, geopolitical risk and other things that could knock that one way.
Work ahead. So, Carlos.
Yeah. Carlos,
If you stick your microphone on, if it's possible.
Carlos from Elliott Management. Hi. I have a question on the structure of the U.S. economy and basically all economies which seem to be changing very quickly. And you're going very quickly with rate hikes. And the point was, Jason Furman, people at Peterson Institute, they've come back to the discussion around the 2% inflation target, whether it's actually 2% or it should be something different or you should be moving to a range. I know you had that discussion when you had the strategy review, and during the strategy review it was decided not to address the question of the inflation target. But it seems to be bubbling under the, so the question is basically that question you could say, well, it's 2-3 years ahead and, it's not something you need to address now. But because you're going so quickly with your rate hikes, isn't it something that you maybe have to address maybe in the next 6 to 12 months? Because you're going to tighten policy a lot, and fundamentally, the discussion is going to come up about, are you really aiming for, to get to 2% very quickly at the cost of a big recession? Or are you basically going to have a slower trend down to 2%? Or are you going to move to something else implicitly? How do you communicate around that and so on? Thank you.
It's certainly the case that a lot of time has been spent talking about 2% as an inflation objective. Why that's a good objective. It's certainly one argument for a higher inflation objective would be that all nominal interest rates would basically price that much higher, and so in the event of a downturn, the central bank would be able to cut interest rates by more and provide more accommodation. With our 2% inflation objective, we hit the effective lower bound twice, almost 3 times when you go back to the 2003 experience. We bottomed at 1% in the U.S. But and so then in order to provide more accommodation, we did asset purchases, and so asset purchases provide more accommodation, but they're much more complicated. They lead to other difficulties, and they're easy for people to misunderstand and take pot shots at. So there is the benefit of it if you had a higher inflation objective that you can provide more accommodation. Now, on the other side of that is we don't really have a great sense as to whether or not inflation volatility would be higher with a higher objective. There's not a really good economic model that says volatility will be higher because inflation objectives on average are higher. However, empirically, it seems to be that way. I think that 2% is an inflation objective that we'll end up, one way or another, having to live with for quite a long period of time. I'm not optimistic that anybody is going to choose to adjust that. And I would just say that's why the long run statement that we put out in September of 2020 was so important in stressing, because we had trouble with symmetry, I would say. Sometimes I look at this and kind of go, 2%, is it an objective or is it a ceiling? And for the longest time, when inflation has been below 2%, you got to go, geez, shouldn't we work harder to get it up above 2%? But one way or another, it's like, I got a forecast that'll take me there. Why should I work harder to do that? And then I'm disappointed. Repeat the process next year. So when we said we should average 2% over time, I think that's helpful. But of course, when you have 8 and 9, of course, it gets ridiculed.
Just in parenthesis, when you had that average inflation agreement, the statement in August 2020, what was the maximum you had in your mind of what inflation would be, say, in 2023? Was it around 3%? I think you made statements saying we would not be afraid to have inflation of 2.5%. Your expectations were very limited, weren't they?
I cannot speak for other policymakers. My own sense. So I thought felt curves flat, except for these. I mean, this is a very unusual circumstance that we're looking at with COVID shutdown, COVID rebound, supply shocks, geopolitical risks. Is that the new norm? Is that what we're going to be seeing over the next 10 years? In which case we could see higher inflation, more difficulties, or are we still going to revert back to a lower trend growth environment that would be consistent with lower interest rates on average, and then that could end up with lower inflation? I don't know the answer to that, but I worry that those problems will come around again. In that environment, I was quite taken with the idea that on average we want 2%, and that might very well mean when you hit the lower bound, you're going to be under 2%, and you want to make up for it on average when times are good. In that sense, I would say 2.5% did not bother me, because we'd certainly be down around 1.5% at other times or that. But I think that it's in the eye of the beholder, and conservative central bankers do not like to see inflation above their objective, period. And so if you think of the objective as ceiling, that might be how they think about it. If you think that we should average it, well, maybe 2.1. 2.2.
We are in another world.
But we're in another world.
Can I just ask you about
You might have to put your microphone on just so others can hear.
Hi, Mark from Reuters. Just a bit of a philosophical question. When you see sterling going as fast and as low as it is at the moment, what do you think from an outside perspective? Obviously, as a major central bank like yourself, how concerning is all of this?
What was the last thing you said?
How concerning.
How concerning.
You're trying to divorce your own being from the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. You're trying to ask you, Charlie Evans, the man on the omnibus.
I'm thinking about the U.S. economy and inflation, and I'm really not qualified to do open economy central banking like you're suggesting, because we don't really suffer from that the same way. But I think that inflation at the moment is a worldwide problem, and everybody's trying to deal with it.
So I've got a couple of gentlemen from over here, but I'd like to ask the lady down here also to open up. You might have to just take that microphone there. Thank you very much. But there's a whole phalanx of people on this side, I can see that.
Thank you. Good morning, Michelle Chivunga from Global Policy House. I'm really interested in your views on, we have the US-Africa Summit coming up in December. So just wondering what you think the impacts would be for emerging markets, especially in Africa with the inflation. Obviously, even in Africa, we're dealing with the challenge with inflation. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue. Obviously, restrictive financial conditions around the globe, make it very difficult for emerging market economies. I mean, at some point, every country has to, be dealing with their own issues, but also trying to take advantage of the comparative advantages that they have. And so, I would hope that development could continue to, infrastructure development could continue to take place, but it's obviously very hard.
Yes, so gentlemen, they've been waiting for, please, yes, you've been waiting very patiently.
Thank you. Tim Jones from Tata. One topic that, in a sense, predates COVID and Ukraine was the decoupling of China and the move globally from just in time to just in case. one would imagine that that should, and we can see this in Tata now, we're doing electronics, we're doing 4G, 5G stacks, we're doing a set of industries in India that one might not have foreseen us doing back in 2017, 2018. So one would expect that that would have a drag because of the pullback in globalization, the lack of efficiency from going from just in time to just in case. Do you think that pullback globally is built into people's forecasts?
I think that, every corporation is asking themselves those questions, right? The resiliency of the supply chain and, the global supply chain, obviously, and it goes back to Fukushima for sure. And, other cases where you kind of realize, well, maybe the supply chain's gone too far, maybe recognizing that China is a communist authoritarian regime. And so maybe they won't, honor my investments over there the way that I would expect to see them honored in the US and things like that. We've all heard stories like that, probably had experiences in that case. And so, that's a risk question, risk return, issue. And so it's not surprising to me that, businesses are thinking about how to relocate it, those supply chains and where they do business. Is it all the way to, bring it back to your own country where it's much more expensive, but maybe that's what's important. I can't say I know how that will play out, and people will make different choices, but except for the fact that you had large investments that were made which are not paying off, I think it's healthy that businesses rethink this, and maybe we push just in time too far. Certainly when you look at the supply chain and how fragile it was in cases, and it was like everything worked when everything worked, and then all of a sudden, built for perfection, but not for. But the switch to goods, goods demand was enormous. The additional fiscal support was extremely helpful and large, and so it's somehow not surprising that the supply chain wasn't necessarily sized to that level, and yet. When I hear, well, you can't find truck drivers, I've been hearing that for years and years and years.
Just staying on that point just for a moment, and then we'll go on to the gentleman in the fourth row. But
Can you find truck drivers in Europe?
we are importing truck drivers from Poland against the original policy, which is not true. But you've got a very strong manufacturing hub in Chicago where you are based. And is it the manufacturers there who are in fact pushing the administration now to be tougher on China, or is the administration taking the lead in terms of this reshoring or friendshoring and so on, which we've heard about from the administration?
I can't say I know about the business push in certain areas. I mean, Chicago is very large, and very big in logistics, all the transportation, sort of railways and highways.
Okay, well, we'll leave that one, please. And then there's another gentleman next to you, and there's a couple down here.
It seems, my name is AJ Dial from Cambridge Investments. It seems to me that there was a slow response mechanism to the data that you were using. Has there been a discussion and debate about quality and the high frequency of the data that you can actually access around inflation that would have given you a quicker stimulus, right? And effectively a quicker mechanism to make decisions?
We are always questioning the data that we have and the sources. Certainly, once COVID hit and we're totally different economy, right? We all of a sudden started accessing real-time data, sources, mobility data and things like that. So we've really taken on a tremendous amount of new data. Pricing data, there's always been, I forget, it started off as the MIT million, goods pricing, and I forget where it is now, but, there's some kind of wedge that's more goods than it is everything else that's in the inflation indices themselves. And so people are always trying to do translations to, how that helps. It just turns out that inflation has always been among, if not the most difficult to forecast variable. I think exchange rates are right up there too.
But are you talking about things like GDP data that you might get from, say, credit card transactions and so on? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's kind of real-time data that will maybe improve maybe the speed of transmission.
I mean, you always think that more data ought to help you, but
Not necessarily.
I mean, so the inflation movements take place, except when they're big supply things, slowly and over long periods of time, right? So it's really hard to find things to grab that. If you knew that we were in a new environment where supply shocks were going to hit it all the time, I'll bet you could find some of those more variable indicators that would help you out then. But then you'd be stuck when it stopped working.
This is the gentleman who's along here. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Albert from Le Monde, the French newspaper. You just asked yourself a question saying, is it a new norm we are in? And you said, after 40 years of low inflation, do you think that there is a reason that we have moved to a higher inflation for a longer time, or is it just a series of shocks that just happened at the same time, one after the other?
Well, I think there's been a series of shocks that's pushed relative prices in big ways, and I think that only gets embedded in long-term inflation if the monetary authority accommodates it. I think the current state of central banks is definitely on the conservative side. I mean, if you think back to big debates about macroeconomics and inflation in the 70s, a lot of this came down to, shouldn't the central bank follow a rule? Because discretionary monetary policy injects an inflationary bias because of that. And I always remember Ken Rogoff from Harvard saying, well, that depends on preferences of central bankers. If you have a conservative central banker doing discretionary policy, they're not going to lead to inflation. They're going to have a preference, for something less. And so I think we have an appropriate appreciation for the costs of unexpected volatile inflation, and central banks are all over that. I think it's been a very unusual set of circumstances that we faced. There's been, perhaps misperceptions of what we were facing, but it's very clear coming out of the Jackson Hole conference in August that central bankers are all over the inflation situation, and they will be making adjustments appropriately.
That's in a way my point. Was there a collective moment, maybe in April or May or June, when figuratively the central bankers of the world went into a cold sweat at night and said, hang on a moment, we're losing this. And unless we do actually show our resolution in an expeditious way, as you've been putting it, we're going to lose the battle. People will not think we are committed to inflation. I think Isabel Schnabel went so far as to say the very bedrock of faith in the European Central Bank could be undermined. I don't think you'd go as far as that, but was there not a collective wake up?
Well, this is a bit like Christian's question earlier when he said what's different between the June SEP and the most recent SEP, and we've had a big increase in the funds rate cap, and I think central banks around the world, have collectively taken that on board. But it's also that the data have revealed themselves to be much worse than we were expecting, and so did I have a bad forecast of inflation? I guess I did. That's almost,
I'm not trying to get you to say it was on May the 21st, but when do you think this change in perception took place?
Every month the CPI comes out, you look at it, you go, oh my gosh, I was expecting it to get better. I think we had a period in July where we got a better inflation report, and when you're looking for some of that to be transitory and you see it, then the next one it's undone.
Okay, well, we're really starting to get going now. I've got about 6 or 7 questions, but first of all, gentleman down here, please.
Thank you. Martin Watkins from Montes. I'm picking up on the fact that OMFIF have got a digital monetary institute set up and thinking about the infrastructure that's required for digital securities, the regulated side. And I'm just wondering, in your medium to long-term projections, what factors, if any, do you bring into consideration around the challenges to fiat currency and also the digital journey that we're going on?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that central banks are studying digital currencies. Some are working on them. The Federal Reserve put out a white paper not long ago where we mostly sort of pointed to issues that we need to think through more carefully. I would say at the moment, certainly in my own outlook, I don't take much of that into account as affecting the inflation environment. And but it's an exciting potential innovation.
Good. So please over here, and then the gentleman Anna behind you. In fact, 3 over there. But first of all, you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Erdal Yılmaz, Central Bank of Turkey, and thank you for your remarks. Really, it's helpful. Right? So the supply shock is not easy to decide how long it will persist and will be with us. That makes our task really difficult. But there are some tools. Let me remind you that there are beige book, for example, that release, or there are some business survey, which really helps to minimize, because you just collect the data from the first hand from the business. They know how long will this shocks. So my question is, do you think that the quality of this survey needed to be improved, or maybe most of the central bank didn't pay attention to this survey, and in order to decide whether this, and how long will, I know it's difficult, but at least there are some information. This is my question. And second,
Could we just have one question?
Sure.
Because we've got
Thank
5
you.
or 6.
Sure. Thank you.
I do think that, survey data have been extremely useful. Business conversations I have with business people, which we do, routinely. That's one of the benefits of having 12 reserve banks spread around the country. I'd say they have been extraordinarily useful in the current period. Just COVID, everybody's talking about what are you doing? We're working remotely. How are you doing? That and trading information, very, very useful. How are you getting employees back into the office? Well, it's kind of uneven. You start a conversation like that, everybody listens, right? And everybody's comparing us. Prices, that's a harder one. If I start a conversation with business people about prices, they'll start talking, and then they'll kind of, this hasn't happened to me, but I've heard stories, way in the past. It's kind of like somebody goes, if I start talking about price increases, you're going to think there's inflation, and then you're going to respond, to that. Businesses are extremely careful about their pricing decisions, right? Just, because they're competing and cost pressures, and why are they able to pass along and get price increases? For the longest time, they haven't been able to do that. Now we're going through a period where they are able to do that. If you catch, I know some small business people who in an unguarded moment, but they're retired, and they'll kind of go, whenever I got a chance to raise prices, I always made sure I could get just as much as I could, because I knew I wasn't going to get much more out of it. There's an entire ecosystem of how this takes place. Then there's the macroeconomics and the aggregate conditions that apply that. So there are many reasons to kind of think there could be some noise around some of the developments, and it takes a while to develop before we see exactly the aggregate consequences. But I think the competition is going to reassert itself. I think that as costs go up, people are going to work hard to reduce those costs, to improve their competitiveness, to get better with market share and things like that. So I think that'll be a more productive time period.
In that little triangle up there, we've got the gentleman sitting next to Anna, and then we'll have you, Anna. First of all, your question, please, sir.
Rashid Shah from Goldman Sachs. When you think about this tightening cycle, how do you think about the balance between rate hikes and QT? Arguably, you could tighten financial conditions more easily by doing more on the balance sheet.
So we're running off our assets now, and it's a pretty steep pace. Of course, we purchased them at a pretty steep pace as well. I think that the QT is probably adding something like 35 to 50 basis points of additional restrictiveness on top of that peak federal funds rate. And so if I think that next year the peak would be 4.5 to 4.75, I'd add 50 basis points to think about, I got some restrictiveness in there. I think if you get to a point where you see inflation falling while you're sitting at that peak funds rate and inflation's going down, you're getting more restrictive again, because the real rate's going up and you're still doing the runoff from QT. So I think that's the point at which you kind of go, have I seen inflation come down enough? Is it clear and convincing? Is this getting us to where we want to be on the right time frame? I think those are some of the questions that are going to, make the individual, policy participants kind of go, yeah, maybe this is the time to reduce it, or maybe this is the time to just make sure we get on top of inflation and bring it down. I don't know how that will play out.
Well, thank you for mentioning QT. Let's have Anna, and then one of your shorter questions, please. And then there's just 3 more questions. And we are running out of time, I'm afraid. But please, have a succinct question.
Thanks very much. I'll try to be brief. Seems like we're using fiscal policy and regulatory policy a lot more in dealing with a lot of the shocks and changes that are coming up. And so I wonder what you think is the correct balance maybe of roles and responsibilities, and maybe the balance of power
between monetary policy and those other areas of policy? Thank you.
I mean, those are very important considerations. I think if I think back to the aftermath of the great financial crisis in the United States and back in 2011, when the fiscal discussion was about austerity policies, and I think, you know, here in the UK, it was very similar in other places, that was not supportive of the stronger aggregate demand that we needed in order to get employment going, get the economy going. And so monetary policy had to do more. And when you're at the effective lower bound, that meant we did QE2, we did monetary maturity extension program, and then open-ended QE3. So matching fiscal policy with what is needed so that monetary policy can focus on getting inflation to its 2% objective without having to run up a large balance sheet that people don't understand very well. You know, that's a plus. Regulatory policies, not sure what you have in mind exactly. I would say in the US, I think there have been, you know, there was Dodd-Frank, and so there was the, you know, emphasis on more and better capital and, you know, additional requirements for the largest financial institutions and all of that. There was sort of a pendulum swinging the other way to right size financial institutions that didn't meet that same risk profile and things like that. So financial stability is very important. So I kind of look to the regulatory side to set that as best it can, because if I have to think about financial instability risk in the setting of monetary policy, it might be at odds with our dual mandate objective.
Well, thank you. We've got 3 questions. I'm going to ask people to put these, lump them together, so not consecutively, but all together. And
I should be more concise myself.
No, not at all. I'm just relying on you to be able to remember the questions. First of all, gentlemen with the pullover, I think you had a question. Did you?
Yeah.
You probably forgot it. Could you put your microphone on? Sorry. And then in the row there, and then.
Patrick Peregrine, I run my own macro consultancy. One of the things, so Chair Powell talks about that policy in his present last week, talked about how policy was only just restrictive. However, when we look at financial conditions, the rate of change is the greatest since 2008. Which also brings me back to the CEF forecast, because we look back at the CEF forecast over the past 15 years, the track record is pretty abysmal. In terms of, well, if you think about the rate prospects and the growth forecasts, and the inflation was always going to come up. And then last night I was actually looking at the June 08 forecasts. And we see the financial conditions.
From this difficulty of getting to sleep.
That's a
Well, anyway, I think
the question was.
Well, the point is not right. It doesn't seem to me that enough attention. We're talking about the massive rate hikes, i.e., nominal rates, but we've been used to a 0 rate environment. So 3% now is very different to 3% in 95 or 89 or stuff like that. So it's the rate of change where people become used to expectations of their interest rate payments, be it companies or households. And the other side of it is just the sheer speed of it. So policy acts with long lags, as we're constantly told by Jay Powell. So is there a risk that enough has happened in terms of the tightening financial conditions already to actually have a disproportionate impact in the first half of next year?
I think we get the message. And yes, please. And we'll try to give you space for a really magisterial answer. So.
Jonathan Betty from Neuberger Berman. You'll be aware that the ECB's asset purchase program now incorporates climate and green considerations. As the Fed delevers and basically goes through tightening, does that end the debate about whether the Fed should consider other considerations in asset purchases beyond being neutral as to the sectors and activities of the underlying businesses?
We only buy treasuries and mortgage-backed securities.
And within MBS, of course, there are different options in terms of what the agencies designate between the green characteristics. And there is, as you know, a debate on whether that should change. But do you think that debate is now over in the current context?
And the final question, thank you for your patience.
Martin Wheel from King's College, London. Could I ask you whether there was any sense that a fear of a sustained deflation was a factor at the Federal Reserve Board that impeded tightening of monetary policy? Certainly, if I think of my own experience at the Bank of England, there was a deflationary skeleton in the cupboard that was brought out from time to time to frighten the MPC. I wondered whether you had any sense of analogy of that. Thank you.
I mean, I think there was a time when inflation stepped down, to like 1%, and growth was weak, and aggregate demand wasn't that good. I wouldn't. If there was ever, concern about deflation, it was very early after Lehman Brothers, when maybe models would kind of say we've got such a high unemployment rate, this, looks like it should be negative inflation. But I would say that for a long period of time, underrunning our inflation objective was a, big bogey that I was concerned about. And, except in the cases that someone mentioned, it's like, well, the SEP kind of saw inflation getting up to, 2% within 2 years. And so good enough. And then you're disappointed because it didn't happen. And then it's like, well, next year it'll be good enough. And you roll that forward. But I don't think we really were overly concerned about inflation. Disinflation, yes. The green MBS, I don't really have any information on that. The way you described it, I don't know who's thinking about that.
It seems to be very much an ECB thing, doesn't it? It's not a Fed thing.
Okay.
And nothing was daring to call into doubt the sanctity of the ECB.
No. That was right. 2008, we didn't report the dot. We didn't report the dot plot. So that could go back to Humphrey Hawkins, when twice a year we put together forecasts, which were never, all that good. The benefit of the SEP is not the real forecast as much as it is, here's what people are thinking about for rates, for policy, and whether or not they're expecting it to be restrictive or not. That's why the person in charge of the press conference, the chair, Bernanke, Yellen, Powell, they don't want to be bothered by the dots when they're not helpful, which is most of the time. But every now and then, they're extremely helpful, and this is one of those periods. The rate of change in the policy rate, how does it compare to other moments? Because we used to have low rates. I mean, fair question. I'll first come back to, in the current environment, I'm trying to figure out what the real rate is going to, the level of the rate that's going to be restrictive enough. And so I have to compute a real rate. I've got to do it with forecasts in mind for inflation, because we're in a period where it needs to be the forward-looking inflation. We'll never get a real rate that's positive if I have to do the 12-month trailing, well, not for quite a long time. And the appropriate concept for the real rate is the inflation expectation. We just haven't always done it that way because there wasn't that much difference. But you're reminding me of something that I read, and I just don't have a great feel for this, but it's kind of like high interest rates in the Volcker period were not necessarily that much more taxing, restrictive for households than what we may be facing.
Much lower leverage.
Exactly, the leverage and the borrowing and the debt and all of that is so we need to take that into account and make a judgment as to how that's holding things back. I'm not usually favorably inclined towards arguments about rate of change of asset purchases versus the level, but of course in December 2000,
explain for your understanding that pretty much anybody under the age of 40 not know the higher interest rate environment is. It basically, we go back to 98. So if you think about anybody who's probably bought a house, first home since then, there's been not just that, businesses have also conditioned themselves to a relatively low proportion of expenditure going toward allocated towards debt service. And all of a sudden that model is shifted dramatically.
Governments as well, of course, in the past.
Well, so a history degree is going to be more highly valued. That's
Well, I was going to say, you've got all this free time on your hands after January, Charlie. So, is there a book coming out of this? I don't think we're going to do your memoirs, but people do write books, don't they, from time to time?
I would have to do some marketing research before I.
Well, if you ever do become a commentator on the ECB, I think you should try to persuade them that they should publish something like a dot plot. I think that is very much needed, actually. So you could join forces with one or two of the fellows around here to ask the ECB to be a bit more transparent about some of their future thinking. That would be a great service to central banking.
I fear I'm an outlier in this. You can probably go to some of my colleagues in the Federal Reserve, ask them their, sympathies of the dot plot. You could get I'd like to get rid of it. I kind of go, I view this as showing your work, you know, it's like, rather than just looking up the answer in the back of the book, you know, show your work too.
Well, thank you for putting it like that. Well, thank you for taking us through this mystery tour of the US monetary policy. It's been a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Very much indeed.